your producer, Julie, who I think died just before this film started. Is that right?
Yeah.
Tell me about collaborating with her and what her producing meant to your realizing this film. And I'm sorry to start with such an
No, no,
emotional
I
thing, but I
appreciate
think
I,
she would be happy
I
that we're up
appreciate
here.
it. She was remarkable. Like I said, she gave me my first job. She worked with a gentleman named Lawrence Bender, who I believe is here, and she hired me, and we never stopped working together after that. Vis-a-vis this story, my father read it first, then my mother and my wife, and then Julie read it, and Julie hounded me for a decade, at least a decade, to adapt it. She knew that it was a story I could tell or should tell, and I just kept getting involved with other things. There were other reasons I procrastinated, but she insisted, and her heart is stamped all over it. Vera reminds me so much of her. Other people who know Julie will see that. So she was everywhere, and we lost her literally right as the funding came together, and it was odd. She stayed present. We didn't have any GERS or yurts, as we say in English, and somebody happened to be driving through Calgary with 40 yurts in the back of their truck, and we, whether she liked it or not, we credited Julie with that. There's no other explanation really why 40 yurts were driving through Calgary. So we just decided it was her. But so she was with us every step of the way, and thank you for bringing her up. The film would not exist without her spirit.
This is a film that's adapted from a short story by Robin Joy Leff, and the short story is a short story. And there are grains of this film in it, but really just grains. What was the essence of what you wanted to preserve, and how did you go about inventing so much of everything that happens in this film?
You know what? I read the story today. I hadn't read it in many, many years.
I did too.
But it's absolutely exquisite. And the last paragraph so captured what moved me when I read this story. It's, again, as he says, it was about a couple in trouble. No particular reason or explanation what trouble or why, but they were at each other's throats. Boy dresses up like Mongolian. They disagree. It becomes violent in a similar way as it does in the bedroom. Dad yanks the costume off. Boy runs out. And they gather in this bush and they just hug. And in the moment of this embrace, they find themselves again. So the first time I read it, I'm just weeping, and and I can't even explain it. I mean, it took me years to kind of figure it out, but I think what it does, and I'm married a long time, and my wife is here, and I love her, and anyone who is married knows how difficult it is. And it was one of the few times I read something that understood the value of resurrecting a marriage that was broken. And it just was deeply, deeply moving to me. And so when it came time to stretch it out, I decided I was going to throw as much shit as I could at that family, right? And obviously, there's nothing more significant. And again, I didn't really know where they'd end up, and I still, don't, right? But I knew that there was nothing more challenging to a marriage than the loss of a child. I'd also experienced that through some friends of friends, and watched it, and there's nothing quite like that in terms of what it teaches us about what's possible in a connection, right? And how easy it is to sever that. At any rate, they all jumbled together, and I just thought, this is a story about not knowing where home is, not knowing what home is, and I wanted them as lost as possible.
So this is a story that is largely set in Mongolia, and if you guys were watching the credits, you saw a lot of Canadian credits. So I want to ask you about adapting your story that is set in Mongolia to Calgary, and what the opportunity was, what the challenges were, and how that ended up working for better and for worse.
Well, we did go to Mongolia, so there's a whole bunch of photography that's shot there at the sort of wide masters, right? And so we scouted that first, knowing we would go shoot those, then went and found places in Calgary, Alberta, which would allow us to back into those masters, right? The reason Alberta or Calgary is that it's the sister city to Ulaanbaatar, same elevation, same population, same population density growth. They share ambassadors, but the real reason is there's 800 Mongolians who live there. All the Mongolians in the film are Mongolian. Nobody plays a Mongolian that isn't a Mongolian. There's only one other place in North America where there were that many Mongolians that we could actually cast the film. There was no infrastructure in Mongolia for the budget we had to make the film, so we knew we were going to shoot here. But if it weren't for the Mongolian community, we would never have ended up there.
And how did you find Jacob? Because this is before he shoots Room. How did your casting directors
After Room.
So he shot
before-
Room,
he
but it
shot
hasn't come out.
And they wouldn't show it to me. They
Okay,
wouldn't
so
let me
nobody
see
has
it.
seen him, really.
No one's seen it.
How did you find it?
He tested for the film before Room. When he was quite young, his agent Brian at UTA sent me a tape of him. I don't know even how they found the script. We didn't have money, but I saw this tape of this young boy. He was a year and a half younger than this, and he was spectacular. So he was always the one to beat. But we'd heard he'd made a movie, and nobody would show it to me, and I didn't actually get to talk to the director, but I did hear from the production that he was worth the shot, that he was going to be good in Room. You know, they were cards were close to their vest, but we, you know, it was instantly clear that he was the boy.
John, in your earliest conversation with Jordan, there are a couple of things that are story-driven in terms of what it's going to mean cinematically, that you're going to have to shoot a documentary, Ismail's film, within the film. But in terms of perspective, in terms of representing Wes's view of the world, what were the earliest conversations about the angles from which you would shoot, how you would capture Wes's perspective on Mongolia and on his parents' marriage, and what did that translate into in terms of how you actually ended up shooting the film?
Well, there was a certain initial interview I had with some of the producers. There was a vision they had of it being done in a very documentary style. You know, I was quite clear in terms of what I said, and Jordan and I had long conversations about this and really hung together on it, that we wanted it to really have a sense where the landscape was controlled and beautiful. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that really, except for a few shots that are clearly barren enough to be a certain part of Mongolia, how seamless the transitions are. I mean, you don't know sometimes when there's a driving shot, and even now I have trouble seeing, because the light and everything, we were able to balance it so beautifully, that it's seamless between a Mongolian shot of the Land Rover and what we did in Calgary. And that was very important to us. Jordan and I talked a lot about, you know, trying to find specific locations on what was it. We were shooting actually quite a bit west of Calgary on First Nations land. So there was a lot of open land there, and we were able to get, you know, very wide landscapes that corresponded, and open range country that was very similar to Mongolia. But Jordan and I had a real sense that we wanted this to be, for the landscape to be a character. And I was a camera operator on Days of Heaven, which we also shot in Calgary, actually not too far away. So I knew the landscape quite a bit. And Jordan and I talked very much about the fact that even though the style in Burn Your Maps is very different than Days of Heaven, that there was a sense of people living in nature, and nature being, you know, a strong presence in the film.
I'm wondering how you worked with your actors and through writing and through directing about what they're grasping at, what has kept them together and what could break them apart, and what kinds of things you had to say to them about how you wanted those scenes to play.
Thanks. Well, so the ground upon which this is built was loss, and I've experienced loss. Most humans, by the time I wrote this, had experienced loss. So I knew that the ground was lost, and where they found themselves again was going to be through the exploration of loss, or the acknowledgement of loss, or the ownership of loss, right? So I knew that. And so I think one of the things we consistently worked on is how do we deny the truth of our pain? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we keep a distance from acknowledging the pain? Because once we start to acknowledge the shared pain in a shared way, we start to connect. And the point was to keep these people disconnected. So in a strange way, we found different ways in which they would deny the pain, right, in different ways. And, you know, the film toys with levity, not toys with, or there's I really noticed it tonight. There's remarkably strange tone shifts in this story for a scene, for a film that's got such dramatic scenes. It bounces back, and that was intentional in the sense that we were trying to mark the landscape of the avoidance of intimacy.
John and Jordan, thank you so much for your time, and thank you guys for supporting the movie.